Greetings, family. Welcome to the African Exodus show. This is the Conspiracy to Erase a Nation segment. To remind you all, this whole segment centers around a book that I wrote earlier this year called Conspiracy to Erase a Nation, where we detail the fact that the real biblical Yasharel, the Israel of the Bible, has been mistaken for a place in the Middle East and Palestine, that the evidence from scripture is all there, that the real Yasharel would have truly been inside of East Africa. So that book is available on Amazon. If you wish to have a free mini version of that book, a mini PDF version, you can go to my Telegram. The link to that is in the description. You just go to the top of the screen and there will be a pinned comment. From there, you can download that for yourself. For this particular presentation, also, I want to tell you, if you're watching on YouTube, you are watching a condensed version, because the first part of this entire presentation, we're going to deal with who are these Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews are a group that is not as much known to people as the Ashkenazi Jews. However, they have just as much significance as far as the history of Yasharel and the erasure of Yasharel. So I did want to cover that, but I will not cover that on YouTube. Instead, that will be on my Rumble channel. So if you just want to watch the full presentation, you can go over there, or you can proceed with this one, because this one we're going to more so delve into the Arab slave trade. There are many layers to the Arab slave trade that we'll also see happen inside of the transatlantic slave trade. However, the Arab slave trade has been largely forgotten and wiped out of the memory of many people. And so we have to talk about it, and we have to talk about the fact that the people who are responsible for collaborating with and coordinating in some respects the Arab slave trade could be looked at as the same exact people who did so inside of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, first, I do want to take just a moment to talk about some of these key players inside of the Arab slave trade. And also, obviously, we have to talk about who were the targets of this slave trade. So the Arab slave trade actually took place 700 years before the transatlantic slave trade. And it happened throughout different parts of Africa, particularly inside of North Africa and also inside of East Africa, and also Western Asia, as well as certain parts of Europe. Initially, when the slave trade began, it was not targeted at Africans or any Africans, really. Many people were victims of the initial trade, including the Turks, the Iranians, Europeans, and Berbers. They were actually initially traded. However, later on, there becomes a shift in opinions or mindsets among the Arabs. And they decide that they're going to shift from targeting these European groups or groups who are of more European descent and start hyper-focusing on the Africans. So the people who become the targets of the new and refreshed Arab slave trade are the people called Nilotic peoples. And these people are going to be based particularly out of East Africa. So let's just name the countries that were targeted specifically by the Arabs. Ethiopia, red flag should go up. Eritrea, another red flag should go up. Kenya, Mozambique, East Tanzania, and other parts of East Africa. So what's very interesting about this, obviously, we talked about where was biblical Yasharel. It was in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, and also Djibouti. So this exact region was literally targeted. That was the number one target of all the other targets. And the other countries are also very, very significant, because what you'll find is that as different persecutions happen on the original Hebrews of this region, they start pushing into the neighboring countries, the countries such as Kenya or Tanzania. So I don't take this as being coincidental that these are the countries that were specifically targeted inside of this refreshed Arab slave trade, where they're now going to have a race-based focus. Something that's different about this slave trade is that people were not taken to the Americas, obviously. They were instead taken to Asian or Arab countries. So, for example, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Turkey, Somalia, other countries throughout the Middle East and inside of South Asia, which is also very interesting because if you know, again, what was prophesied about the Hebrews, they would be scattered to not two corners of the earth, not one corner, not three corners, four corners of the earth. They would literally be scattered all over. And while the transatlantic slave trade scattered to the Western Hemisphere, the Arab slave trade scattered the Hebrews to the Eastern Hemisphere. Now, a big reason why the Arab slave trade has largely been forgotten is because the means of which people were oppressed was very different. So, for example, we know inside of the transatlantic slave trade that many people were chattel, and they were also forced to reproduce. They were basically being used to make more and more enslaved people, right? That was the way that they kept up the number of Africans in order to keep their slave class as a certain population. This was not the case in the Arab slave trade, which is interesting. So essentially, the Arabs looked at the Africans and said, okay, castrate the men. So castrated the men. And after castrating the men, they basically took the women, made them concubines, and the men were hired servants, hired slaves. So a lot of these people were castrated, obviously horrible, and a lot of the women became, I hate the word concubine, when it's actually being raped and used as a sex slave to these Arab peoples. So because this was the case, and it wasn't like a, we're going to have these people stay inside of this place and we're going to stay over here. Instead, the African women who were taken to Arab countries were forced to reproduce with Arab men. Because of that, a lot of the descendants of the Arab slave trade are not as identifiable as the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade. So a lot of people, you could tell in Arabian countries, have African descent, but it might be more watered down. Some people you can't tell at all. But it's very important to emphasize inside of these Arab countries where people do have noticeable African characteristics, they are treated, as is the case with all our people wherever we are, they are treated as being animals. They are dehumanized. They are discriminated against. There's many, many stories about this inside of Arab countries. So the curses followed those people. Even the descendants who might not call themselves African, not even see themselves as Black, some who have been so watered down over time, these same people, again, are the same people who have been castrated inside of their society because of who they are and because of the weight that they bury because of their bloodline. So what was the effect of the Arab slave trade on Africa? Well, between 650 and 1900, it's estimated that 10 to 18 million Africans were enslaved by Arab traders and taken over the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Sahara. The castration of enslaved males and the concubinage of enslaved females has resulted in descendants of enslaved Africans in Arabia being difficult to identify as their ethnic bloodlines faded over time. Now, something else very interesting about the Arab slave trade, as I am staunchly an advocate of this position, that the Oromo people of Ethiopia were actually the Hebrews, the original Hebrews of the region. It's so interesting. These people were the exact targets of the Arab slave trade. In fact, the demand for Oromo slaves, particularly the females, was very high because of their supposed sexual temperament and also their beauty. So they were specifically targeted Oromo people, and the women were specifically targeted to be concubines. So very significant, again, because we understand that these people had a focus on a particular people of a particular region whenever they went and invaded and went and conquered and went and did horrible things to scatter these people and also erase their identities. One last thing I'll emphasize about this slave trade is that although, again, it's not well studied and not really as talked about, it was just a very horrible and horrific slave trade, just like the transatlantic slave trade, to the point where I don't like if people try to say transatlantic was worse. They were both really bad. Literally inside of the Arab slave trade. So as we said, they could go into Asia, but they also went through the Sahara, because North Africa was also one place where many Africans were taken. And many people died, like literally just died in the desert. Starvation, thirst, died in the desert, and they just left their bodies and just kept moving. So this is such a horrible instance of barbaric behavior by these people. But now we have to deal with the question, why? Why were these people so vehemently against this people from these East African countries? Why were these people specifically targeting these people inside of this region? What becomes the case is that the Berbers actually are going to collaborate with the Arabs inside of the Arab slave trade. And this very much could be the reason why there became a shift from the Arabs going after Berbers and going after Europeans and going after people who look more like them to actually going after the East African people. The Berbers have always been present in collaborating with the Arabs inside of the Arab slave trade. And this goes back to who we were talking about previously when we were talking about a particular people who we have linked to Esau, or the nation of Edom, who we have biblical prophecy telling us would have a contentious relationship with Yasharel from the point of not just Jacob and Esau being in the womb, but moving forward from there. So this people we have linked to a people called the Berbers, and we're going to now link them to another people called the Sephardic Jews. So if you want to see this part, again, you can continue on to my Rumble. If not, I thank you all for watching, and y'all willing, I'll see you in the next video.